A recent flashpoint in the Voice referendum is whether the Voice will lead to treaty and whether the treaty will include compensation or reparations or a financial settlement. I've covered this previously. However, now Anthony Albanese has commented on it. Anthony Albanese claims that he opposes compensation or reparations for indigenous Australians. These comments came in an interview he gave with Neil Mitchell of 3AW. Let's take a listen.
Is it unreasonable to ask, though, for people to read those extra pages and say, well, what about a treaty? What about reparations? What about truth-telling? And then say to you, well, what is your view on those three things?
Well, there's nothing... Well, what's not legitimate is to pretend that that is what the referendum is about. There's nothing in the Uluru Statement about reparations. There is, in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, there's truth-telling. Well, what, is anyone actually against telling the truth? That's well,
it depends. Truth according to who? I mean,
that's a difficult argument to have. Sure, and that's
what is your view on reparations?
A separate question. I don't support reparations.
Will we have to negotiate that at some time?
No, look,
regardless of the Voice. I mean, sometime down the track, do we face that?
No.
Well, but we're talking about Indigenous affairs. We're talking about a crisis, as you've described it, which I think is a legitimate use of the word. It's also legitimate to say, if this gets up, if you get the Voice, do we then turn to a treaty? What do we do then?
What you do then is we will have recognition in our constitution. That's the first thing.
Yes.
We're the only former colony in the world that doesn't have it. Only one.
But you know there's no real objection to recognition.
Isn't there? Why hasn't it happened? 122 years.
Fair point. But in this debate, there is no real objection to recognition,
Neil,
even from Peter Dutton.
Neil, if this was just about recognition, if that was the question there, the same people would be saying, but what does it mean? What does it mean for treaty? What does it mean for reparations? What does it mean for all these things?
Let's now dissect this. We should note, however, that in this very same interview, Anthony Albanese denied reading the 26-page background document, or really any of the background documents surrounding the Uluru Statement.
They know the Uluru Statement from the Heart is one page, not hundreds of pages.
But what are the other 25 pages? I've read them. What are they?
What they are is a record of meetings. Some of them, they're records of the big lead-up that happened.
Do you agree with most of what is said in those 25 pages?
I haven't read it.
You haven't read it?
There's 120 pages. Why would I?
And if he had read these, he might realise that compensation might in fact be on the cards. Now, it is possible that Anthony Albanese is simply lying. It's possible he is simply not telling the truth in this interview. But let's be generous. Let's assume that he is not fibbing. Now, this might be a generous assumption. After all, he has called for a treaty in the past, and it is slightly ridiculous to suggest that he never considered what a treaty would involve. This is especially the case since he has been around Uluru Dialogue members for years. It's amazing he never stopped to ask about this. It's amazing he never did anything to clarify this at the beginning of the Voice referendum. It is amazing that he didn't build in safeguards into the Voice referendum to prevent treaty or to prevent compensation actually existing. It's amazing he didn't adjust the referendum text to ensure this would be the case. And therefore, I simply don't really believe him. But in any case, let's assume that he's actually telling the truth. Well, if he is telling the truth, it is about his present intentions. This is what he means at the moment, his intentions right now. But intentions can change all the time. Malcolm Turnbull, for example, likes changing his mind whenever it suits him to skewer his former colleagues in the Liberal Party. After all, Anthony Albanese himself once called for reparations. He did this in a letter he penned himself as a young activist. Now, this, of course, was some time ago, but it would mean that his intentions have now changed. Will his intentions change again in relation to treaty and compensation? We don't really know. The problem is he's talking about his present intentions of himself, not his future intentions, not the intentions of someone else. This is hardly reassuring, even if he does genuinely intend to resist compensation right now. One thing that is notable is that Anthony Albanese has stated that it is, quote, not legitimate to say that compensation is part of the referendum, and that it is not in the Uluru Statement. Well, this is verifiably false. It is legitimate to ask what the Voice entails. Now, even if those questions are a little bit broad-ranging, even if the Voice doesn't entail compensation, it is perfectly legitimate to ask whether it does. And it is legitimate to ask what the Voice's goals are. It's legitimate to ask whether they are intending to achieve compensation, or financial payment, or reparations. It is legitimate to consider this when voting. It is legitimate to consider what a vote actually implies. After all, if you're voting for a piece of legislation, you need to know what that legislation means for you in the future. And this is even more the case when you are voting on a referendum that would change the constitution and be very difficult to reverse. Now, I have covered some of this previously, but to reiterate, Anthony Albanese has called the idea that the Uluru Statement is more than just one page a, quote, conspiracy theory. But in fact, there are over 100 pages of background documents. This includes a 26-page document that is called the Uluru Statement, although it also might be background documents. But in any case, it doesn't really matter whether it's background or core to the Uluru Statement. It helps to define what is within that one A4 page main statement. That is, it helps to tell us what the goal of the voice ultimately is, and it is therefore legitimate to consider it, and it is therefore part of the whole debate. And Anthony Albanese is simply gaslighting to pretend that it is not legitimate. As I have said before, the Uluru Statement clearly calls for a makarata. This is both in the one A4 page summary and in the background documents. And those background documents specifically say this would involve a financial settlement, possibly coming in the form of a proportion of GDP. It is perfectly legitimate to ask about whether that is now inherent in what the voice intends to achieve. Now, Anthony Albanese might claim these are merely goals. The federal government need not agree to them. The federal government could resist any claims for compensation. However, there are issues with such a statement. First, there's the issue that Anthony Albanese has seemingly rolled over whenever the Uluru dialogues have asked for something. For example, he framed the referendum text in the way that it is because that's what he was asked to do. It's not clear that he would actually resist such a request in the future. Second, the voice could credibly threaten to grind government to a halt, or at least to grind it slower, if the government doesn't negotiate on a treaty. Now, this isn't merely supposition, it's actually quite a possibility. This is because of basic tenets of what's called administrative law. This is the law that governs how administrative agencies, so the executive government, operates. Under basic legal principles, the government is bound to consider all relevant matters when making decisions. So the question is, what exactly is a relevant matter? Well, in this context, the voice referendum effectively deems any voice representations to be relevant, even if they are ridiculous on their face. This enables the voice to effectively sue government for failing to consider what they deem to be relevant matters, and therefore they can just litigate whenever the government disagrees with what the voice wants them to do. Now, they might ultimately lose at court. However, the voice would have vast pools of taxpayer funds, and also the stress, acrimony, and pain of dealing with litigation would mean that bureaucrats would often acquiesce to such litigation threats. But in any case, the fact that the voice could take an antagonistic approach to government, potentially slowing down government, making things more expensive, if the government weren't to negotiate on compensation, tells us clearly the compensation could in fact be brought back to the table. Third, the voice has more access than any other Australians. The voice, by dint of this referendum, would be able to access the executive government and the parliament. Ordinary Australians don't have that access. If you are the only person in the room, that gives you power. And if the government never hears a counterpoint to compensation, well, the voice would clearly get its way. Now, to think about this, let's think about a court case. Say you only hear one side of a court case, well, the outcome is going to be obvious. If you only hear one side of the demands for compensation, well, clearly the outcome is going to be obvious. The fact that the voice has access and money means that the voice has power, and therefore it is in a privileged position to push a demand for compensation. And the government simply might not hear any counterpoints to compensation, or at least not hear them quite as vocally and vociferously as they would from the compensation demanders. Furthermore, and this notwithstanding, a government could undemocratically agree to compensation. So to think about this, when people vote for a government, they often vote on a broad platform of policies. They might vote for a politician despite his or her agreement with a particular position. For example, people might have voted for Anthony Albanese despite his stance on voice, treaty, and compensation. Given that the voice is currently polling very badly, and the majority of Australians seemingly are going to vote no, that could in fact be the case. But in any case, a politician might get up even though people disagree with parts of that politician's platform. So let's take an example. A politician might get into government despite the fact that they're okay with compensation. And this might occur because the opposition at that time is incredibly weak. It could mean that the majority of Australians are now saddled with compensation that they never really wanted. And let's face it, the Prime Minister of the day might simply agree to compensation in order to get likes and retweets on Twitter. The Prime Minister of the day might not really be considering how much that compensation will cost everyday Australians. They might simply be thinking about how they feel when they're engaging on social media. But overall, the idea that reparations are not on the ballot is frankly ridiculous. They very clearly are. Anthony Albanese should know better. and I assume he probably does know better, because people are right to ask about what the voice entails, and Anthony Albanese is coming across as if he is gaslighting. His comments simply don't hold up to scrutiny, and he really should start engaging with these concerns, rather than dismissing them as if they were irrelevant. Because Australians are concerned, Australians are asking these questions, and the burden is on him to come up with persuasive answers for why they shouldn't be concerned, and his answers so far aren't doing the job.